Welcome to SROA Soundboard, a podcast for radiation oncology administrators. Here's your host, Tammy McCausland.
Hello, I'm joined today by Jennifer Willyard, Director of Operations for the Department of Radiation Oncology and Applied Sciences and Department of Dermatology at Dartmouth Cancer Center. We're here today to talk about strategic plans and how to create a practical path from ideas to action. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me today. I'd like to start with a question about leaders working in radiation oncology. They often have big goals but limited time, resources, and bandwidth. Why is it so hard to move from vision to implementation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to answer it, I really draw on my project management background. So I've been a project manager for over 20 years. And within project management, there's a triangle. And the three legs of that triangle are scope, time, and resources, whether those resources be budget, whether they be people, whether they be expertise, etc. I think what a lot of people don't realize is that as your scope increases, the other legs of the triangle also have to increase. You need more time, you need more people or dollars or expertise. And similarly, if you say, well, this is a really narrow scope, but all of a sudden you have scope creep, or you say, oh man, it's taking so much more time than we thought that it would, it indicates that you probably have some sort of misalignment in those three arms of the triangle. And I think that unless you've worked in project management, that's not always something that you recognize or that you even think to include in your planning. And that can be why it's so difficult to go from this vision or this idea of where we should be or where you want to be to actually implementing it. Scope sometimes tends to be ill-defined, right? So if it's not specific enough, if you haven't included the things that you're not going to do, you run the risk of increasing that scope, and then your project is just going to take more time and it's going to require more people or more dollars, and not everyone is prepared to invest those additional resources.
And thinking that probably a lot of leaders in radiation oncology don't have a project management background, what guidance would you give them to sort of make sure that they don't have scope creep, or that they understand if one pillar of the triangle increases, the others have to also increase?
Yeah, I would say one of the most important things that you can do is to write down what are your goals, what do you believe your scope to be, who is the project team, just the information that would be in a very basic charter. So if you're standing up a project, you can have very detailed statements of work, especially if you're engaging with a consultant. You've probably seen those kinds of statements of work that say, this is what we're going to do, and this is what we're not going to do, and the customer will do this, and the consultant will do this. You can take that idea, but make it, a single PowerPoint slide and just say, okay, what's our goal? What's in scope? What's out of scope? Who's going to be working on it? About how long do we think it will take? And just the act of writing it down gets you kind of to step one of what I think are values that can build upon themselves. So visibility leads to transparency, and without visibility and transparency, you're never going to have accountability. So that charter is your first step of visibility and transparency. What are we working on? Why are we working on it? Who's working on it? And how long do we think it will take? What are some of our expected outcomes, the goals and milestones we're going to be looking for along the way? And that doesn't have to be complicated to be helpful. Just the act of putting a little bit of thought behind it will get you a lot farther than if you just started the work, but no one knows why you're doing it or what you're actually hoping to achieve at the end.
That's really good guidance. So thinking about people writing it down, what are one or two common mistakes leaders tend to make when they try to take the plan they've written down, even if it's on that simple PowerPoint slide, to operationalizing it?
I think there's what I would say is that there's probably one mindset that's really important to embrace, and it's something that I've talked about at past presentations at SROA conferences, and that's adopting the mindset of a pragmatic visionary. And what that means is that you have to be facile at both understanding what is that big strategic goal and how does it get broken down into this actionable project or tactic. But at the same time, you have to be able to look around you and see what are all the tactics that we're working on, and what does that say about what our priorities are or what our strategic initiatives should be. So I think that's something that can be challenging, is that people say, okay, well, we have our strategic goal, so my work here is done and my team can execute on that goal. But unless you've done the work of breaking that down into something that is actionable and achievable, not just, reduce this time frame from 24 hours to 18 hours, you need to say, okay, but what project are we going to spin up to do that, and who's going to work on it? Again, really kind of not just stopping at the vision level, but really being intentional about how we define that as a project. That's a common mistake, because a lot of times the teams that we are giving these projects or tactics or asks or goals to, they have day jobs, and that job is the operations of the clinic. And so they don't have the time or the bandwidth, or maybe sometimes even the skill set, to be able to break that goal down into those actionable steps. So that is, I think, something that is a common mistake of thinking that once you've done the goal, you're done. And then the other, I would say, is kind of the opposite, is that sometimes we need to embrace the human resources approach to management, where we understand that the people who are doing the work are in the best place to innovate on that work. So sometimes we may think, oh man, I have this goal, I better break it down into projects, but we don't engage the stakeholders who are intimately doing that work every day to help us say, okay, well, what are some of the pain points, and how can we smooth these workflows or level load these resources to make sure that we can achieve these goals? So I think it's kind of that interplay, again, of the high level and the on the ground level, whether that be for the goal, the tactic, or the resources, and being able to tap into who's the right role to help guide at each of those levels. So I think that's kind of two sides of one coin that I would say is represents both of those challenges.
So is engagement of the human resources side often challenging for leaders?
I don't know if it's challenging for leaders in that we don't think that our teams are capable of doing it, but I think it can be challenging when you see that you have teams that are flat out and very, you may be resource constrained. They may be doing, overtime, especially right now in healthcare when we're all just kind of financially more constrained than we have been in the past. You may not have infinite FTEs anymore. And I think we're all trying to figure out, how do we bring the most important items to the top of the list, because we know that we have constrained resources, whether they be dollars, FTEs, or both. So as you go back to that triangle, if you have limited FTEs, limited dollars to achieve your goals, you might have to think about the timeline. It may take a little bit longer to get that work done, or you may have to make the scope a little bit smaller, break it into a series of smaller projects instead of this one kind of comprehensive, we're gonna solve all the world's problems in one project approach, which can be, it can be hard to break from that mindset, because a lot of times as leaders, we can see what the next 3 steps are. We know that this is a foundational piece, but it's not the end goal. It's just one goal along the way. So it can be challenging to say, no, for today, this is enough. This meets the bandwidth and the capacity of my team. Now, I would say that if you feel that you can't entrust the human resources that you have to be able to innovate and develop, then you might need to say, okay, what are my expectations? How are they not being met? And how do I bring that team up to a spot where they can have some flexibility and space to innovate in ways that feel free and that we trust each other in that process?
And assuming that you have a good strategic plan and a good implementation plan, and you're going along, but then you need to maybe revisit priorities or adjust a plan. You kind of talked about this a little bit, but how would you tell leaders that they need to be aware of when it's time to revisit or readjust?
Yeah, ultimately, I think it comes down to partially documentation and partially time, right? So as you're launching a project, ideally you've documented what are the reasons that you put this at the top of the priority list. Is there a regulatory requirement that you're not meeting? Have you seen a pattern of safety events or near misses that you want to address? What are the assumptions that are being baked into why we're launching this particular project? So part of, as a project leader or a project sponsor, your job is to constantly go back and revalidate that those assumptions are still true. So anytime that you have a regulatory change, you should say, wait, before we continue this work, does that regulatory change impact this project work? If you had a pattern of near misses, but now you're not seeing that same pattern, I would stop and say, okay, what changed? Are people just not reporting, or was there some other change that happened that now makes this project unneeded and therefore freeing up bandwidth to do something else? If you had assumptions, were they correct? You know, one of the pieces of organizational theory, one of those constructs that I really adhere to is that of equifinality. And that just means that if you give teams a goal, there can be any number of ways to achieve that goal. But then the question becomes, how do you know if our tactic is a good one? And what organizational theorists talk about is match between complexity of the problem and complexity of the solution. So an easy example of that is if you walk into your house and you flip on the light switch and nothing happens, and you say, well, I guess my wiring is bad, and you start to rip out all of the wiring, you missed an opportunity to say, well, did the light bulb go out? Right now, if you keep experiencing that same light bulb going out every few weeks and you just keep replacing the light bulb, you're missing an opportunity to say, my easy solution doesn't seem to be matching the complexity of the problem. Here in New England, we have a lot of really old homes. So is there a mouse that is in your wiring? Do you have knob and tube somewhere that is short-circuiting your light switches all the time? So, you know, you really need to do that assessment of what is my understanding of the problem? Is the solution that I'm pursuing showing me, giving me clues that perhaps I misunderstood the problem? And we have some tools to do that, you know, a root cause analysis. You can even just, if you have a broad enough stakeholder list, you could say, something doesn't seem to be working here. Does anybody see something that I might have missed? So I think that that's another great tool that I use, is just revalidation. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time that something goes wrong, but if one of those assumptions or one of those regulatory requirements or whatever your other inputs were for doing the project, if those change or you have indications that maybe they weren't the right path, don't use that to say, well, I guess this was worthless. Really use that to say, okay, let's sit down and talk about it, and how can we reform this project? Do we still need it or do we not? And then the second one is just time. If you have been working on the same project for 2 years and you're still not at the end, I would just say, okay, we've been working on this for 2 years. Do we still need to do it? At that point, people have probably mentally moved on, if not physically moved on, from either your project or your organization. And you might have a whole new set of stakeholders. So that's one that isn't necessarily guided by any milestone or problem in the project. It's just a function truly of time.
The analogy of the light bulb is really great, and also your point about, you know, maybe the project is taking too long, and maybe those valuable time and resources and people are better spent on something new. Thank you for that. How can leaders tell if they have too many projects going on at once?
So if you go back to visibility, transparency, and accountability, what I would say is, how big is your list of projects? If you say, oh, I don't have a list of projects, then you're never going to know if your list of projects is too long. So one of the things that I always say is that visibility starts with a list. Just write it down. Go to your leaders within your department or within your section and say, hey, what are the things that you're working on? And you'll see that that list gets really big. We just did this probably 5 months ago within our department. And what I found is that there were over 80 projects that we were all either working on or said that we should work on. And what I have found since then is that, people said to me, well, yeah, but that does, those are just extra things. That's not even my list. Like, what do you mean that's not your list? Do you have a list? Can I get that list, right? I want to have all of the inputs as I'm constructing this overarching list of dreams and ideals and goals and just operational needs. So that's the first thing. If you don't have a list, you will never know, truly, except apart from burnout and stress and your team saying, we're being asked to do too much. That's a sign. And it doesn't mean either that every project is the same size, right? So you may be able to do a lot more small projects, but really only one big project. So there's balance too. So you need to know what work you're doing, and you need to know something about that work. What is its scope? What is its scale? What is the expected duration? So that's the transparency. What are you doing? And what does that work look like? And those would be the two things that would kind of key you into, short of just, mass hysteria in your department if you have too many projects happening all at once.
Related to that, every project is important to someone, but obviously leaders can't say yes to every project. So how can leaders manage that human side when they have to defer, decline project ideas?
Yeah, this can be challenging, and my vice president, we laugh a lot because she says, well, everything is a one when it comes to priority. Everything's a one, and she knows that about herself. And I think it's an easy trap to fall into, because you're right, there are real people and work consequences to not being able to address all of these challenges. So one of the things that I like to do is get the collective wisdom of all of the people in the department. And that was kind of an impetus for us to do a modified Delphi in February of this year. We said, okay, I have this whole list now of 80 plus projects. There's no way we can work on all of these things at once, so what should come to the top? And I feel that if you can modify that Delphi process to give you quick feedback, you can get a lot of feedback that allows you to leverage the human resources approach and really let the team tell you what should come to the top. So what that involves is sharing your list of work and allowing teams to say, what is the most important thing? So when we did our Delphi process, I invited everybody who was a team lead or above to participate in a session where we sat down, looked at the full list. We said, what should we continue to do? When we had that list, then we prioritized it. We said, what point value would you give to this project? And we did that several times and made kind of hard line decisions. If a project didn't have 15 or more points, it wasn't moving on to the next round. It doesn't mean that it goes away. It just means that it lives in a backlog. So when we do address those items that are at the very top of our priority list, and we say, we have a project done, we know what's going to come next. So in a traditional Delphi, you would do all of this work anonymously, and it would happen iteratively over a number of months. And I said, I want to get the amount of feedback, but we have to do it in one meeting. And that meeting is going to be 2 hours long. So how can we do it? So I think our team has enough trust to know that if they disagreed with someone else, that was okay, that we could have productive conversation about it. I didn't have psychological safety concerns within the team. So instead of doing anonymous feedback, we just did simultaneous feedback. And the way I did that was to give the team auctioneer paddles that had numbers on them, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So once we said, okay, here's the list of projects, what should come to the top, here's the first project, how many points would you give it? People just held up their paddles all at the same time and either gave it a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or no points. And it was really enlightening because our department chair attended this meeting. And what he saw was that the projects that he thought should come to the top received no votes or no points from many of the other team members. And that gave him an opportunity to say, maybe the way that I'm viewing the clinic is a little bit separated from day to day, from the people who are on the front line of, should they be accessing this EMR and be facile with this tool, etc. It was really important to him. It just wasn't super important to anybody else.
It's very interesting.
To his credit, he took that feedback and said, okay, yep, I can support what the team has said. So I think that was really great. It was good for him to see what the priorities of the rest of the team were, but it was also great for the rest of the team to see that if they spoke up, that he would say, yeah, that makes sense. I can go along with what you're saying. So I think for both sides, it was really great. And at the end of the day, we came out with a list. We took our list of 80 down to 3 projects that we were going to work on. I did have a few others, I think about 9 others that I said, these are mandatory, they're not optional, so I'm gonna automatically bump that, that group of 9 to the end. But still, 12 is very much more doable than 80. And now we have something to work from, that's our backlog, and we're gonna do a reprioritization effort in August to make sure 6 months will have passed. Are those items that we thought were truly important still the items that should be on that list? And has anything new entered the chat that we need to address?
That's an amazing process and outcomes. You have used tools like project backlogs and prioritization frameworks. For leaders who are new to that kind of structure, what is a simple first step they can take?
Yeah, again, it starts with a list. So I used to work in the criminal justice field, believe it or not, and a lot of those lessons carried over. And I was working in Texas with a Central Texan, born and raised, and we would be going to county judges and talking about court-appointed counsel. And there were a lot of data needs because there were legislative requirements that, time frames for when you need to appoint counsel and how you screen people. And a lot of the judges would say, well, I don't have any data. And my colleague would just say, well, Judge, all you need is a Big Chief tablet and a number 2 pencil, right? So, recognizing that there is always a place to start. And if you have no list, you can't jump to accountability. You have to start with visibility. So find a way for everybody to come together and tell you what they're working on. Once you have that, then you can start to round out a little bit more information about that project. And each time that you do this exercise, you'll get better at knowing what questions to ask about the project, but you'll also be ingraining within your teams that this is something that we do. We document the work that we're doing. We share lessons learned across teams and across projects. We raise barriers and risks and issues in a timely manner, so that way the work can progress. But really that first step is just making sure that you have one place where you're documenting all of the work.
That's great. For leaders trying to move from intention to action, and also when they have a lot of ideas but no clear path, what would you tell them to do first?
I think the first thing would be to think about that pragmatic visionary mindset, right? So if you're someone who just by your nature tends to function at that high strategic level, just know that there are people who you've probably asked to execute that work who don't really understand what you're trying to ask them to do, right? So, or you might be so far ahead, you say, well, if we can do this, then in 5 years when this happens, we'll be prepared to do some other step. That is so far removed from the day-to-day operations that you need to make sure that you're opening that dialogue to go from idea into how would we operationalize this. There's nothing magic about setting a goal that says, this is our goal, therefore it will be achieved. Right, there's still that dialogue and that interplay between the vision and the project. How do you break it down? Is there something foundational that you need to do? If you say, we're going to improve this from 5 to 10, but you don't actually have a data collection tool readily available for you, then you have to do pre-work before you can achieve that goal. And that pre-work is implement the data collection processes to allow us to know our baseline and to be able to monitor it moving forward. So, I would say the pragmatic visionary mindset is also one that recognizes that we can't always jump directly to what that end goal is. It's there's back and forth between what information do we need, what information do we have, how accessible is our information, and how can we automate some of this information collection. If your goal is dependent upon a person doing manual chart checks, that goal is going to be really difficult to achieve, or you'll do the project once and you won't have any way to assure that you've maintained that forward momentum. So really being thoughtful about what are the precursor events that you need to have in place, the precursor systems to ensure success will allow you, even if it takes a little bit more time to get to a tactic to truly address the goal, it'll make sure it's much more sustainable. So I would say just don't get wrapped up in here's the goal we're going to achieve in these 12 months, and really be honest about where your systems and where your department is to even be able to understand what your current performance is. If you can't do that reliably, it's going to be really difficult to understand what tactics are needed. Should you be replacing a light bulb, or should you be tearing out the wiring? You're not going to know. So, be open to that and don't get frustrated by it.
I'd like to circle back to the human side of all of this stuff we're talking about. So we're currently in an environment where people feel like they have too much to do, and then they to be asked by the leader to do one more thing, even to kind of prioritize projects. How would you tell leaders to kind of approach their teams in terms of prioritization and kind of looking at getting projects from strategy to completion?
Yeah, so the first thing that I would say is don't assume that your team really does have bandwidth to do projects. So one of the things that I always ask my team leadership is, what is the pain point in the clinic that is impacting your bandwidth the most on a day-to-day basis? A lot of times these are standard work needs. Well, the challenge that we have is that this physician likes this way, and this physician likes it this way, and this physician wants this, and this physician wants to be communicated with this way. And they're so wrapped up in documenting who wants what in which way when, and to be communicated with which tool, that they truly don't have bandwidth to do anything else. So sometimes those prerequisite events are creation of standard work. Departments, sections, teams get into states where they're operating at sort of chaos levels all the time. And the reason that there's very rarely a single project that's going to address that chaos engine. Generally what happens is, as a system, you got to this state of perpetual chaos together. So you're going to have to do system-wide a series of steps to be able to smooth out that chaos, right? So if it is this provider wants this and this provider wants something else, and we communicate with this provider this way, but we use this tool to communicate with this provider, that's something that grew up over time. And so you might have to do a series of projects to say, okay, I'm going to implement some communication standard work for providers, but I'm also going to do a work on psychological safety to empower RTTs to push back on physicians and say, no, this is the standard work that we've adopted and we have to adhere to it. So I think there's kind of a functional baseline of core operations that you have to make sure is set first. Because if you don't have that, you really won't have bandwidth to do other projects. If people are customizing every step for every piece along the way, they will not have time for anything else. So that, for me, is really step one. Once you have that foundational operation, not saying it has to be perfect, but just create some standard work to take some of that mental load off of the team, then you can say, okay, now that that standard work is being addressed, what is kind of the non-day-to-day operational thing that you think should come to the top? And often that's a project that can go above and beyond, or what's that near miss that we had that we want to make sure we address. If you don't have a process, you can't improve upon it. And so if you are process-less and have no standard work, you're not going to be able to improve. And that's really one of the core tenets of continuous improvement, is that without a standard, you cannot improve. So make sure that all those standards are set, they're understood, they're visible, and that you hold people accountable to them, and then you'll be able to do the next level of work, which is improving those workflows.
You will be presenting From Intention to Action, Approaches and Tools to Activate Your Strategic Plan at SROA's Annual Meeting in Boston. What can attendees expect to take away from your talk?
I think even more detailed examples and talk through of how we implemented that Delphi process. There'll be screenshots, there'll be pictures. You'll get to see some of the auctioneer's paddles, right? We may do a little exercise on how to do that in a large group setting. But I'm also going to talk a lot about how I've continued to monitor progress. So we did this work in February, and guess what? Just by saying that something comes to the top of the list doesn't mean that automatically everyone has time to devote to that, or that it happens the way that we thought that it would. So I'm going to talk a lot about how to get to the point where you've set your prioritization, but then give tools and techniques on how to maintain that accountability piece. Because the Delphi is the visibility and the transparency, but you also have to do the accountability. Otherwise, things will just slip to the bottom of the list, and you'll be back to where you started.
Well, thank you for the wonderful insights you've shared today, and I look forward to attending your talk in Boston. Thanks for your time, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. To learn more about SROA, visit www.sroa.org.